15 wounded American service members quietly came off the Pentagon casualty ledger in a single afternoon last week. No briefing, no correction, no name signed to the change. One day they were counted among the cost of the Iran campaign. The next day they were gone. Now, I have been around this kind of work long enough to tell you something plain. In that building, on that subject, the number does not go down. It stays the same, or it climbs as the medical reports come in. It does not shed 15 people between lunch and dinner with nobody willing to walk out to a microphone and explain why. And that is not the only number moving in the wrong direction. 385 on the day the ceasefire took hold, 428 by that Monday, then 15 gone, then another quiet subtraction, a final figure of 411 sitting on a page that the Office of the Secretary of War will not come out and defend. Reporters calling the Pentagon and being told a duty officer will get back to them, a duty officer who days later still has not called. Hold that image a minute, because it matters. 200 sailors were injured in a fire aboard the USS Gerald R. during this campaign, and those sailors are nowhere on the official tally. That is the Navy's newest aircraft carrier, the flagship of the modern fleet, and 200 of its crew are missing from the page. I will come back to the Ford, because the story of how those men and women vanished from the ledger is the story of how this whole thing works. And here is the part most people have not heard yet. While all of this is playing out over who got hurt, there is a second set of numbers coming out of Washington, numbers about what this short campaign did to America's weapons cupboard that turned the whole picture on its head. Towards the end of this, I am going to show you exactly what the Pentagon's own shelves look like right now, and why every reassurance you are hearing from that podium is at odds with what the administration is quietly doing behind it. Most people heard ceasefire and heard the word over. In reality, the accounting has barely begun, and somebody in authority is betting you will not keep watching. I am asking you to keep watching, because when a wounded service member does not make it onto that ledger, something very concrete happens to them, and it happens in the dark. The Purple Heart, the oldest military decoration this country awards, the medal George Washington himself authorized back at Newburgh in 1782, only gets issued to somebody whose name is on the book as wounded in action. No name on the book, no medal. And the medal is not just a ribbon, it carries tangible consequences. It affects disability ratings. It affects how the Veterans Administration treats you when you come home with a headache that will not go away. It affects the paperwork that follows a soldier for the rest of their life. So when 15 names come off a list in an afternoon, we are not talking about numbers in a column. We are talking about whether a 22-year-old from Ohio who took a concussion in the Gulf gets treated when he is 50 as somebody who was hurt in his country's service or as somebody who was not. The ledger is not bookkeeping. The ledger is the door. Now then, let me lay this out the way it actually happened, slowly, because the story is being told in a way that makes it sound like a clerical problem, and it is not a clerical problem. On the day the ceasefire with Iran took hold, the official count of American dead and wounded stood at 385, a hard number, a sober number. The kind of number a commander puts his name next to. By the following Monday, with the guns gone quiet, that count had moved to 428. And give them their due, a rising total after a shooting stops is not by itself a red flag. Injuries surface slowly. Concussions take a while to announce themselves. Wounds get reclassified once the doctors get a proper look. That part is ordinary. Here is the part that is not ordinary. In a single day, 15 wounded service members simply came off the list, came right off the page. The total dropped to 413, no briefing, no footnote, no explanation from the building. A quiet little subtraction, and then another until the official figure settled at 411. Reporters called. Reporters called again. What they got back was a line about a duty officer who was unavailable who would get back to them. Days went by, that phone call never came. Let me say it plain. In that building, on that subject, numbers do not go down. They stay where they are, or they climb as the medical reports come in. They do not shed 15 people in an afternoon with nobody willing to sign his name to the explanation. Hold that thought, because I want to come back to it. I want to come back to it with a story from 2020 that tells you exactly why a pattern like this matters and why anyone who lived through the last round of this has no business shrugging it off now. We will get there. Most people hear ceasefire and they hear the word over. They think the bill has been totaled up and the cost is what it is. In reality, the accounting has barely begun. The wounded who made it out are still being diagnosed. The injuries that will take a month to declare themselves have not yet been written down. And somewhere in that gap between what has been reported and what the medical system is quietly processing, the true human cost of this war is sitting, waiting for somebody with authority to speak its name. Now, some of this first came to light through reporting by The Intercept, an investigative outfit that has made a habit over the years of going after stories that the Pentagon would rather not see in print. They started pulling on the thread of how the totals were moving. And once you start pulling, you find out the thread is attached to something much bigger than a typo. The system that is supposed to track all of this is called the Defense Casualty Analysis System. That is the official ledger. It is the source of record for Congress. It is the source of record for the president. It is the one place in the whole of the federal government that is supposed to tell the truth about what this war is costing in American blood and tell it in a way that cannot be spun. And that system right now appears to have large categories of injury that are simply not showing up on the books. Here is how the trick works, if you understand the categories. The Pentagon classifies casualties in a couple of buckets: killed in action, wounded in action. Then a third, softer category, the non-hostile injury, accidents, training mishaps, fires. And it is that third bucket where a lot of wartime injury quietly gets laundered. Because if a sailor breaks his back in a fire on an aircraft carrier that is operating at wartime tempo in a wartime theater, the injury can be recorded as non-hostile, as just a bad day at sea, and it never shows up in the count of the cost of the war. The fire happened because the ship was doing what a wartime ship has to do, but the paperwork says peacetime, and the public sees a smaller number. Consider the fire aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford. That is the newest aircraft carrier in the fleet, a $13 billion ship, the flagship of the modern Navy, carrying a crew of roughly 4,500 sailors sent forward into that theater precisely because of the Iran campaign. During this campaign, a major fire broke out on board, and more than 200 sailors were injured. 200 sailors. And yet, when you look at the official casualty tally, those sailors are not there. They are nowhere on the page. The same pattern holds for incidents on the USS Abraham Lincoln during active operations. Sailors hurt, nothing counted. Sit with that a minute. We are not talking about borderline cases. We are not talking about a cold somebody picked up in a mess hall. We are talking about a carrier fire serious enough to put 200 young men and women into the infirmary, and it does not appear in the number the American people are being given as the cost of this war. And if anybody wants to tell you a carrier fire is a small thing, I want you to remember July of 2020. The amphibious assault ship Bonhomme Richard, sitting in San Diego Harbor, caught fire. It burned for 4 days. 63 people were injured, sailors and civilian firefighters. When it was over, the Navy scrapped the ship, total loss. Over $1 billion of American warship gone, just like that. The Navy does not take carrier fires lightly because the Navy knows what a carrier fire can cost, which is why 200 injured sailors on the Ford is not the kind of thing that falls through a crack by accident. Now, I want to come back to that promise I made, because before anybody calls this an accident of paperwork, we have all been here before. In January of 2020, after the United States killed the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, Iran fired a barrage of ballistic missiles at the Al-Assad air base in Iraq. That same night, from the White House, we were told, and I am paraphrasing, that no Americans were harmed, that there were no casualties. That was the initial word from the president himself. Within days, the Pentagon came back and said, well, actually, 11 service members had suffered traumatic brain injuries. Then the number went to 34, then 50, then 64. By the time the dust settled, the figure was over 109 American service members wounded in a strike we were first told had caused 0 casualties. And it was not over there either. That same president, sitting in the same Oval Office he sits in today, went on television and called those injuries headaches, said they were not very serious. A couple of things he said. Some of those troops had been knocked unconscious in reinforced bunkers by the force of ballistic missile detonations. Some of them are still carrying that injury today. It took more than a year of quiet pressure before the first Purple Hearts from that attack were approved. That is the cost at the human level of the number game. Somebody else carries it long after the news moves on. Same administration, same pattern, same impulse to manage the number downward first and let the truth catch up later. That is not ancient history. That is the living memory of how this has gone before. And when the same building, under the same leadership, starts quietly walking numbers backwards 5 years later, an honest person asks the obvious question, whether this is a filing error or whether this is a habit. Now, credit where it is due. The building has pushed back. The spokesman for the Department of War, Sean Parnell, has said the military has everything it needs to operate and has stood behind the official figures. And I want you to know who is speaking when Sean Parnell speaks, because it matters. Sean Parnell wore the uniform. He served as an Army infantry officer in Afghanistan. He came home with his own Purple Heart, earned the hard way, and with wounds he still carries today. So he knows better than almost anybody at that podium what it means when a soldier's injury lands on the page and what it means when it does not, which is why the position he has been put in is a hard one, and I do not envy him it. But the truth of the matter is, the man defending the ledger tonight is a man who once depended on that ledger himself. I am not in the room. I do not have the medical charts. I am not going to tell you I know the final number. What I am going to tell you is that when your official ledger drops by 15 without a single sentence of explanation, and when 200 wounded sailors from a carrier fire are missing from the page, the burden has shifted. The burden is no longer on the press. The burden is on the building. And here is where it gets harder. United States Central Command has declined to brief on any of this. The Office of the Secretary of War, which is the name this building has gone by since Executive Order 14,347 last September, has likewise gone silent. No press conference, no detailed statement, a duty officer who never calls back. That is not how a confident administration behaves. A confident administration gets out in front, gives the number, explains the methodology, and takes the hit. This is something else. Now I want to turn to the part of this story that I think is the real reveal, the part that tells you why the number game matters beyond the number itself. Because while all of this is playing out over casualty counts, there is a second set of numbers coming out of Washington that puts the whole picture in a very different light. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, a serious think tank down in Washington that is read carefully inside the Pentagon, released an analysis showing what this short campaign against Iran actually did to America's weapons cupboard. And the findings, if they are anywhere near correct, ought to stop every American in their tracks. The United States, according to this analysis, has used up at least 45% of its precision strike missiles, roughly half of its Patriot air defense interceptors, the shield that keeps incoming missiles from hitting American troops and American allies, more than half of its stock of terminal high-altitude area defense interceptors, the system we rely on to shoot down longer-range ballistic missiles, around 30% of the Tomahawk cruise missile inventory, more than 20% of the long-range air-launched missiles known as JAS-SM, roughly 20% of the SM-3 and SM-6 naval interceptors. These numbers, the analysis notes, line up closely with what the Pentagon's own internal assessments are showing. Let that land. In a matter of weeks, the United States burned through somewhere between a fifth and a half of the critical munitions it would need in a major conflict. And here is the piece of this that nobody in either party likes to talk about because it makes everybody uncomfortable. The United States at the end of the Cold War had somewhere on the order of 50 major defense contractors building the tools of American war. By the middle of the 90s, after a wave of mergers that the Pentagon itself encouraged, we were down to about five companies: Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, which is now called RTX, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics. That consolidation made the books look neater. It made a handful of executives very rich. It did not make the country more ready, because when you have 5 factories making the things that keep American soldiers alive, and you suddenly need to triple your output, you cannot. The factory does not exist. The second shift does not exist. The trained machinists do not exist. A Patriot interceptor costs about $4 million a round and takes roughly 2 years to build from the day the order is placed. A THAAD interceptor costs more than $10 million and takes longer. Tomahawk production runs at a rate the Navy has been trying to climb out of since the Obama years. You cannot solve that problem with a press release. You cannot solve it with a tax cut. You solve it by actually building factories, which takes years, and hiring workers, which takes years, and qualifying new suppliers, which takes years. We are not in a position to fight a short war with a long memory. We are in a position to fight a short war and then pray nothing else happens for the next 3 years while we catch up. And the single biggest concern raised in that CSIS report is not even about Iran. It is about what happens if, while our shelves are this bare, we find ourselves in a crisis with a country the size of China. Now, I want you to consider this from a chair in Beijing for a moment because it matters. There are analysts in the People's Liberation Army right now whose entire job is to study how fast the United States burns through its munitions in a real fight. And they are looking at the numbers out of Iran with a pencil and a legal pad, and they are working out what those numbers would mean if the 7th Fleet had to defend Taiwan tomorrow morning. That is not hypothetical. That is their job, and they are doing it tonight. The signal we have sent in a few weeks of bombing is that the arsenal of democracy can be drawn down to the studs by a middle power with a ballistic missile program. If you are sitting in Beijing, that is not a deterrent message. That is an invitation. Now, the president has waved this off. He has told reporters the United States has a virtually unlimited supply of missiles. And I want to be respectful here because I have sat behind that desk and I know how a commander-in-chief has to project strength. But the actions of his own administration tell a different story than his words do. If the cupboard is truly full, you do not turn around and propose a defense budget of $1.5 trillion for the 2027 fiscal year with a huge slice of that spending aimed specifically at restocking munitions. If the cupboard is truly full, you do not have Pentagon officials quietly reaching out to General Motors and to the Ford Motor Company to see whether civilian manufacturing lines can be redirected toward making artillery shells and missile components. And I want you to understand what that phone call means historically. In 1941, when Franklin Roosevelt called the auto industry into the White House and asked Detroit to stop making passenger cars and start making tanks and aircraft, he was inventing a thing we came to call the arsenal of democracy. Ford built a plant at Willow Run that turned out a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at its peak. General Motors converted entire factories to make machine guns and engines and shells. That is the playbook somebody in this Pentagon just dusted off. You do not pull a page out of the 1941 book unless the shelf really is that empty. Those are the moves of a government that knows the number the president just gave is not the number on the spreadsheet. And this is where the two stories snap together, the casualty count and the missile count, because what you are really looking at when you put them side by side is a pattern of an administration that is telling the public one story while the ledger behind the curtain tells another. If the human cost is being trimmed and the material cost is being downplayed, then the war the American people think they just watched end is not the same war the Pentagon is quietly still cleaning up after. And that, more than any single missing number, is what ought to worry every single one of us. Because in a democracy, the public is the one who has to sign off on war. The public is the one who sends the sons and daughters. The public is the one who pays the taxes and lives with the consequences and votes up or down on the leadership that made the call. And the public cannot do any of that if the numbers are being quietly laundered on the way to the microphone. I want to be fair to the people in that building. I have worked with them. Most of them are decent, serious professionals doing a hard job. The Defense Casualty Analysis System was built years ago precisely so that what happened after al-Assad, where the number kept limping upward in embarrassing installments, would not happen again. It was built to give Congress and the President one trusted source of truth. When that system stops doing its job, it is not just a bureaucratic failure. It is a failure of the promise the country made to the people it sends into harm's way, that we would at least be honest about what happened to them. And I want you to picture something for a minute, because behind every name on that ledger is a household, a mother who has not slept through the night since the day her boy deployed, a wife who checks her phone every time it buzzes, who watches the driveway for the car with the two officers in dress uniform. Who knows what that car means? A father who taps his son's picture on the refrigerator before he leaves for work in the morning. Those families are the ones who are waiting right now on the truth of what happened over there. And what they are being handed instead of the truth is a ledger with missing entries, a spokesman who cannot produce a duty officer, and a president telling them, we have virtually unlimited missiles, while his own Pentagon is on the phone with Detroit. That is what this story is about. Not politics, not strategy. A family in Pennsylvania or North Carolina or El Paso waiting on a number that somebody in authority has apparently decided they do not get to see. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a few clean questions that nobody in authority has yet been willing to answer. How many American service members were actually wounded in the Iran campaign? Where did the 15 who came off the list go, and on whose signature? Why are the 200 sailors injured in the Ford fire missing from the count? Why has Central Command gone quiet? Why has the Office of the Secretary of War gone quiet? And how, on a cupboard this bare, is the administration planning to handle a second round of this fight, which is exactly the round the ceasefire extension is, at best, only delaying? Those are not partisan questions. Those are the questions a free people have every right to ask their own government and to keep asking at volume until somebody with a name and a title sits down and answers them. I will close with this. I have seen this country come through harder seasons. I have seen administrations of both parties get things wrong and then eventually get them right, because the American people would not let the matter drop. Watergate did not resolve itself. Agent Orange did not resolve itself. Gulf War illness did not resolve itself. In every one of those fights, the veterans and their families had to push and push and push against a government that had decided, for reasons that felt sensible to somebody in an office, that the truth was more trouble than it was worth. And in every one of those fights, eventually the truth won. Not because the government surrendered, because the country refused to look away. That is the part of this story that is still, in my view, hopeful. The numbers are moving in the dark because somebody in the building is betting the public will not keep watching. The antidote is simple, and it is old, and it has never stopped working. Keep watching. Call your member of Congress. Demand a hearing. Demand the names on the ledger. Demand the duty officer pick up the phone, because the families of those 385, those 428, those 200 sailors on the Ford are owed better than a silence dressed up as procedure. We have been through worse, and we have only ever come through it because ordinary people refuse to accept less than the truth. I still believe, on my best days, that the country is made of that kind of people. I have to believe it. And tonight, of all nights, so do you.